Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jackie, and always thank you to the silent angels behind the scenes, allowing me to be with you on Zoom this morning. It is just an absolute joy to tap into the spiritual power of zeal. It is this spiritual power that has inspired me this week in receiving the message, which we know is always above all for the teacher who's speaking it. In honoring the role that gratitude has always played in my healing and in my life, and as a way to bring my American spiritual family into the energy of Thanksgiving, which is always a blessing, I'd like to share this from one of the authors. This came to me about gratitude. Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns whatever we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, and a stranger into a friend. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace today, and paves the way for tomorrow. So we say together, thank you, God, as we prepare to open our hearts and our minds for whatever is ours to give, to receive, and to accept this morning. And no Seinfeld today. I got this little chuckle from my brother John, who I swear wants to be with us since he visited, and some of you were able to meet him. So here goes the minister practicing joking. He says, so hey sis, we're expecting such a cold winter this year that the squirrels are collecting more nuts than usual. So far, 3 of my closest relatives have disappeared. To which I wrote back a question. Only 3 questions, Mark. And, so God bless our families. God bless all those who are part of our spiritual family. And thank you for being here to support me and Unity Church of Rochester this morning as we go forth into today's truth lesson. The scripture that inspired me this week is taken from Genesis. And since some of you know that I have broken through into some kind of new beginning, I felt that it was very timely that I would have been guided to metaphysical understanding of this story, which, yes, will bring us back to how excited we can be about the life that we have been given. And so we prepare to receive and to accept this word from the book of Genesis, verses 12 to 26. And the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, son-in-law, sons, daughters, whoever you have in the city, bring them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who married his daughters, and says, up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he seemed as one mocked by his sons-in-law. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand and upon the hand of his wife and his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto them. And they brought him forth and set him outside the city. And it came to pass when they had brought them forth that he said, escape for thy life and look not behind thee, neither stay thou in the plain, escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. And Lot said unto them, O not so, my Lord, behold, thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, and thou hast magnified thy mercy, which thou hast shown me in saving my life. And behold, now this city is near to flee, and it is a little one. O let me escape, and my soul shall live. The sun was risen upon the earth when Zoar was entered by Lot. And then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and plains and all the inhabitants and that which grew upon the ground. But Lot's wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Yes, she did. Crystallized by her fixation on the past. Crystallized, literally turned into a pillar of salt, symbolizing what can happen to any one of us when and if we do not access the spiritual power of zeal, which is a spiritual power. And what I'm finding is that even though there are times when Charles Fillmore uses zeal interchangeably with enthusiasm, my understanding suggests to me that zeal as a spiritual power can only be quickened and activated in the silence. Enthusiasm for life, for this beautiful life that we've been given. Exuberance pouring forth from us. Both of those, both enthusiasm and exuberance, are byproducts of tapping into the real power, the spiritual power that we celebrate in unity gatherings around the world during the month of October. And that is the power of zeal. To be able to make the distinction between this spiritual power and its byproducts of enthusiasm and exuberance has made a world of difference for me, because I am naturally enthusiastic, because it is easy for me to throw my arms around my life and give thanks. It is easy for me to bypass the fact that both of those, enthusiasm and exuberance, are actually byproducts of the real power, the spiritual power, the power that waits for me in silence. For when I can access that spiritual power of zeal, there is harmony, there is equilibrium, there is balance. And so it is that the words of the psalmist, that the zeal of thy house has consumed me, do not come to pass, because we are quickened by a spiritual power, a power that resides in the silence. What came to me was really interesting, and I didn't even look it up. Sometimes I'll just get a tune, and the tune was A Fool on the Hill. A Fool on the Hill. And I thought, what does that have to do with what's being shared this morning? And then I got it. It was an acronym, HIL, just one L, far as I can tell. And I said, oh, Lord of my being, let me not be a fool on a hill as I learn to be excited for the life that I've been given, the life that courses through my veins, which is very different from the experiential life that the ego wants to call real, which is the narrative or the story of what's happening at any given moment in my life. So here is my best understanding of the rich, rich symbols in the story of the fires that burnt up Sodom and Gomorrah, my best appreciation and application of what Lot and the burning of those two cities and the looking back of his wife all symbolize for my journey. We know that in Unity, we approach the Bible as a series of symbols, timeless such that they are, all symbols which properly understood represent my life, what I'm learning, what I'm growing through. And so in looking at this story about fire that burns, some of you recognize that I have been referring in class to my own experience of the last few weeks as a spiritual fire. Until a prayer partner pointed out to me the elements, the function of fire, I was stuck on the image of spiritual fire. Can you picture the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah ablaze with the color of the month, orange, totally on fire? And what is it when we are given the blessing of a very personal spiritual fire? What is it? What is it for? What does it come to do? And sometimes I miss the forest for the trees because obviously the purpose, the function, and the effect of any fire is that it is a cleansing. It is a purifying. It is a complete and total healing, release, power. I like to look specifically at what Fillmore says in his dictionary about these basically just 3 or 4 symbols. I was most encouraged and affirmed by what he says Sodom represents. And now I'm going to link back to you, for you, with you, for me, the opening part about the hill, that acronym. Oftentimes the spiritual power becomes clearer for me when I look at its opposite. So in looking at I feel very excited about the life I've been given through the spiritual faculty of zeal. What's the opposite of zeal? Closest I can imagine is a kind of inertia. Inertia, a kind of maybe feeling stuck, blocked, some congestion. So this inertia with its first letter I represents for me the middle part of the acronym of the hill. And here's what Sodom represents: a destructive, concealed habit. Wow. Certainly I got to look at that in the last month and a half or so. What mental habit was I participating in without my awareness? So we have these 3 elements that we take with us into our week. Certainly I do. I know that one of the greatest gifts that I get over the years from listening to Unity teachers and lessons are the application that I can take into the rest of my week. So I don't want to be a fool on a hill. I'd like to be an inspired, illumined, enthusiastic, exuberant about life person, and notice that I'm not staying on the hill, but moving to the mountaintop. What's this hill? Well, the H is for habits, mental habits that I have been able to identify during my recent spiritual fire. One of those habits actually captures the meaning of Hagar. One of the mental habits that needed cleansing, purifying, and releasing was the ability to lapse unwittingly, seemingly without consciousness, into looking back into the past. And so I give you these three as an invitation this week to look at any mental habits that might be seducing us without our consciousness. Old patterns of belief, maybe even old values that used to work, but that don't anymore. Certainly a lot of this came up for me as I opened to receive the gift of my physical opportunity. And so the hill, H-I-L, you know what? We can put an extra L on it and make it habits, inertia, and looking back lots. This is what happens when the spiritual power of zeal is not quickened, when there is not enough time spent listening in the silence for this zeal, which essentially is the opposite of inertia. Zeal is defined as the impulse to go forward. All of life, this life that we're excited about, everything about life is naturally moving in a forward direction. But if we have habits that are unaddressed, habits that are allowed to float into consciousness, it will easily seduce, I know me, into looking backwards at what was, what could have been, what used to be, what I haven't forgiven, what I've not been forgiven about, all of that, not allowing time in consciousness every 60 seconds, as I now like to tell myself, to practice instead a consciousness of the presence, a consciousness of the presence. And so Sodom, as a city that needed burning up in me, represented a concealed habit that was destructive, a habit that was beneath perhaps my awareness and needed time spent in the quiet, listening, asking which mental habits are ready to be burnt up in me at last, because they are not a blessing, because they are creating inertia, and because they are habitual and destructive. And so it's easy then to give thanks for the spiritual fire that came to burn up that Sodom within, to burn up that city, this city that was concealing a tendency to stay in the past. Let's just take that in for a moment. Let's just take a conscious 30 seconds to acknowledge those things from the past, which perhaps are ready to be burnt, purified, released. Old beliefs, old attitudes, old habits of thinking. What about Gomorrah? What about these two cities on the plains where Lot had inhabited Sodom at one point? What does Gomorrah represent? Well, not surprisingly, it represents that tyrannical state of mind, that state of mind that is adverse to the spirit. Can you imagine that each of us on a daily basis gets to be more and more aware of the Gomorrah, how much Gomorrah still needs burning up in me? How much of my consciousness is spent being adverse to the invitation of spirit, to the voice of spirit, to the call of spirit to be still. Be still. I need do nothing but listen in the silence in order to tap into the real power, which is zeal, the real power which is the impulse to move forward. We cannot move forward without addressing those habits that are mental and destructive, hence the H, habits. We cannot be illumined, uplifted, sustained, and propelled by zeal, this spiritual gift, without noticing parts of our consciousness where we might be inert, lack of energy, lack of zeal, lack of excitement, lack of celebrating this life that we've been given. And of course, then after we have H for habit, I for inertia, and looking back lots, it becomes easy to raise our awareness about how zeal and exuberance and enthusiasm can function in right ways, in godly ways, to propel us forward on our spiritual journey. I don't know about you, but that's one of my top 3 goals that I take inventory about, is to be continuously open to the guidance of spirit in my understanding and in my moving ever forward with my vision of a spiritual life. So the last 2 symbols, which really helped me internalize and integrate what I want to do with the faculty of zeal, how I want balance when it comes to enthusiasm and exuberance, its byproducts. The last 2 symbols are the 2 protagonists, the characters in our Bible story, Lot and Hagar, his wife. Lot, metaphysically, we're told, represents that part of us that is still in darkness. The part of me that had still entertained unconscious mental habits of looking back, unconsciously manufacturing or resulting in a kind of inertia. Well, how did I apply this? What did I do with this? Well, for one thing, when it has to get so loud that it shows up in the body, and that hasn't happened as a blessing for me very often. So when it did this time show up literally under my skin, I was determined to notice what habits I had fallen into mentally that I was unaware of. I was willing to notice that if I was not being propelled forward through spiritual zeal, then there was some kind of inertia, blockage, congestion. And what was it? And finally, was I ready to stop entirely the mental practice of being seduced into looking at the past? And so my affirmation for myself during the worst stages of it became, attention must be paid. Was kind of obvious because I had little choice as the symptoms got louder. Attention must be paid. Attention must be paid. And so I sat listening, waiting for the faculty, the spiritual gift of zeal to propel me forward. And sure enough, there came the opportunity. I talk a lot about my cousin who lives in the Toronto area. And for no fewer than 10 or 15 years, even when I was still, teaching full time, and he was too, they would invite me on holidays or vacation. No, not for me. I'm not interested. Why would anybody travel when they can stay home? And right on divine appointment, just as I said, I'm done with old habits of limitation or looking back or feeling in any way stuck. I'm open to moving forward. He called and invited me on a trip. And the little ego was on the scene going, you don't want to go. You don't need to go. What is that? And I just said, yes. I think I shocked the daylights out of him as I went and paid for health insurance and looked at the dates and saw how it would work with my ministry schedule. But the point was, attention had to be paid. A change had to happen in the outer that would be outpicturing the change that was percolating in me. And so it's interesting that we can really, really recognize Lot. The character of Lot represents the part of me that was still in darkness. And so I invite that light. I sit and listen rather than talking. Just listen, 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 so that the true spiritual power that could propel me out of the past, out of the habits, out of inertia, and out of looking back lots, got me off that hill and can take any one of us. Spiritual zeal can move us to the mountaintop of peace. So we leave the hill this morning. We leave the habits, the inertia, and the tendency to look at the past. And we dwell in the next 60 seconds of life that is living us and of this amazing life that each of us has been blessed with. And surely enough, when we tap into zeal, the exuberance, the excitement, and the enthusiasm about life propel us forward into whatever comes next with anticipation and with joy. And I always like to mention to myself, so I share with you the etymology of enthused, which is so simple, a Greek preface and a Greek word we recognize, theos, for God. So when I am enthused, I am in God, provided that I have tapped first into the spiritual power of zeal with enough time listening in the silence. What's fun about Hagar as a symbol is that she represents a fugitive, somebody who's in flight, somebody who's running. She's a wanderer. And it's interesting that in this flight, we recognize that our attachment to stuff in the outer, the sensual, has to give way to the spiritual. We need to present ourselves willing to detach from everything out here, give way to the spirit within, because the sensual, the stories, the attachment, the facts, the narratives cannot stand in the presence of the Christ truth. It will flee. Yes, it will. Represented by Hagar. And so we see all of that stuff, the habits, the inertia, the old things that were keeping us inert. We see them in flight, fleeing, because they cannot stand in the presence of the Christ. Metaphysically, Fillmore received this inspiration about Hagar. He says, Hagar represents the part in me that is a stranger to the spiritual phase of my soul. So she represents the part of me that has not tapped into the spirit within me. He goes on to say that Hagar, that phase of us that is a Hagar, are those thoughts and emotions that are probably selfish and unholy. Can we identify some of those? I sure can. The ego shows up knocking on the door of my consciousness quite regularly. I'm just getting to know it better and can hear its steps coming down the hall. So Hagar represents the phase of my soul that in its thoughts and feelings is likely selfish, unholy, and guess what that produces? Fear and uncertainty. Let's just breathe in the beautiful life that we've been given. Let's just understand this wonderful spiritual faculty of zeal, this energy, this force, this spiritual power, this omnipotence, which allowed to have its way in us, propels us ever forward. And so we open to this faculty. We open to leaving the hill behind and moving to the mountaintop of that joy which can only come from within, that joy which we consciously bring to celebrating the life that we have been given. This is the truth, and I name and claim it for myself as I share it with you